February 20th, 1943 North Africa. Through the haze of battle near Kasserine Pass, 5 American Sherman tanks emerged from the dust, moving like predators through the desert. They advanced without signals, without flags, without a single word exchanged. Yet they struck with eerie precision. German Panzer commanders stared in disbelief. How could enemy tanks, separated by ridges and smoke, move as if controlled by one mind? What they were witnessing wasn't luck, and it wasn't magic. It was a revolution, one invisible to the naked eye, carried through the air on waves of radio frequency. This was the moment the Wehrmacht first realized something was terribly wrong. Their meticulously trained armored divisions, the pride of Blitzkrieg, were being outmaneuvered by American tankers with far less experience. The secret lay not in the Sherman's armor or gun, but in the strange hum of a new kind of radio, the SCR-508, a device that turned every Sherman into a node of a network decades ahead of its time. In this episode of War Chronicles, we'll uncover how this one invention, born in an American factory far from the front lines, transformed tank warfare forever. How an engineer's obsession with radio clarity shattered the myth of German technological superiority, and how invisible signals decided battles long before the first shot was fired. The North African campaign was chaos incarnate. Heat, dust, and mechanical failure turned tanks into ovens and men into ghosts of exhaustion. Every engagement was a test of endurance and communication. The Germans, veterans of years of mechanized warfare, relied on their few G5 radios, the pride of pre-war engineering. But they were amplitude modulation AM sets, plagued by static and interference. On a moving battlefield, they might reach a mile, sometimes less. The Americans, newly arrived and untested, had something radically different: frequency modulation FM radios, developed by engineers at a small company called Galvin Manufacturing, later known as Motorola. These sets cut through noise and static like a knife through silk. When the Battle of Kasserine Pass began, this difference, unseen, unheard, but everywhere, changed everything. German Panzer IVs opened fire across the valley. Their formation was perfect, their discipline unmatched. But within minutes, the pattern fell apart. Orders from command dissolved in static. Command tanks, easily spotted by their extra antennas, became prime targets. When they burned, their platoons went blind. Across the battlefield, the Shermans were improvising seamlessly. Tank commanders who had never met were coordinating movements across miles. One crew's warning became another's survival. Their voices were clear, immediate, unbroken. A captured German signal operator later reported, "The Americans speak as if they are in the same room. Our radios only scream." The American system's heart was the BC-604 transmitter, delivering 25 watts of power, more than double the German standard. It operated between 20 and 27 MHz, using crystal-controlled channels that never drifted off frequency. The result? Reliable, static-free voice communication, even under artillery fire. In contrast, the German AM systems treated every spark plug, ignition, and engine vibration as an electrical storm. Crews shouted over the noise. Coordination broke down. The innovation wasn't purely technological, it was philosophical. Where Germany built machines for elite crews, America built systems that made every soldier part of something larger. As a Signal Corps engineer later recalled, "We weren't trying to make a better tank. We were trying to make every tank talk to every other one like neurons in a brain." That invisible brain, this early form of networked warfare, turned the tide in countless unseen ways. The Americans could adapt mid-battle. They could coordinate artillery, call for air support, or regroup under fire without hesitation. Meanwhile, German forces designed for precision collapsed under the weight of their own silence. This wasn't just a difference in machines. It was a difference in worldview. One side believed in the power of individual brilliance. The other believed in the power of connection. And in the deserts of Tunisia, connection won. But this was only the beginning. To understand how America built this invisible weapon, we must return 2 years earlier to a quiet lab in New Jersey, where a brilliant but frustrated engineer defied the entire U.S. military establishment. He believed radio waves could change the fate of nations. And he was right. 2. The birth of the network. From laboratory to battlefield. To understand how a handful of American tanks outcommunicated Germany's finest, we have to rewind to July 1941, months before the U.S. even entered the war. Deep inside a laboratory in New Jersey, a small group of engineers were working on something. The Army didn't even think it needed a clear voice. They weren't soldiers. They weren't tacticians. They were radio dreamers, men like Daniel E. Noble and Henry Magnuski of the Galvin Manufacturing Company. And what they were about to create would redefine modern warfare. Imagine the clatter of metal, the buzz of vacuum tubes, and the smell of solder burning late into the night. On the walls hung blueprints marked SCR-508 tank radio prototype. At the time, radios inside armored vehicles were an engineer's nightmare. The inside of a tank was a furnace of vibration and electrical noise. Every movement, every gear shift, spark, and shot fired sent interference roaring through early AM radio systems. German engineers had accepted this as a fact of life. Their solution: keep radios simple, limit transmission power, and rely on a strict command hierarchy. But Daniel Noble refused to accept that limitation. He believed in frequency modulation, or FM, a revolutionary idea pioneered by Edwin Armstrong. Unlike AM, FM wasn't distorted by static. It could deliver crystal-clear communication, no matter the chaos around it. When Noble proposed installing FM radios in tanks, Army officials laughed. One colonel reportedly told him, "Son, this is war, not a broadcast studio." But Noble and Magnuski persisted. They re-engineered FM transmitters to survive the shock and heat of tank combat. They hand-built crystals that could lock a signal in place, even under vibration. Every resistor and capacitor was tested under simulated explosions. By mid-1941, they had done the impossible, created a rugged 81-pound radio set, the SCR-508. It consisted of the BC-604 transmitter and dual BC-603 receivers, allowing a tank commander to monitor 2 channels at once, one for his platoon and another for company command. It was, in essence, the first battlefield network. Each Sherman tank could now transmit, receive, and relay information in real time. There were no command-only tanks anymore. Every crew was connected. Every voice mattered. This idea, equality through communication, would become a quiet revolution. By 1942, the United States had entered the war. Detroit was building tanks faster than Germany could destroy them. But radios, delicate, hand-calibrated instruments were another story. Each SCR-508 contained 748 individual components, all assembled to exact tolerances. The transmitter alone had nearly 400 capacitors and 385 resistors. Producing them in mass quantities required a transformation of industry itself. At Motorola's Chicago plant, factory workers, many of them women, learned to solder microscopic joints by hand. Posters read, "Your hands are America's voice on the battlefield." By the end of 1943, over 11,000 tank radio sets had rolled off production lines, each one tested, tuned, and stamped with a small plaque. SCR-508 S, Signal Corps. Those 3 letters S, C, R, stood for Signal Corps Radio. But among the tankers, they came to mean something else: stay connected, regardless. Meanwhile, in Europe, German Panzer divisions faced an invisible wall. Their few G5 systems, once cutting-edge, were already obsolete. The 10-watt transmitters could barely reach a kilometer in combat. Tanks without transmitters, often 4 out of 5 per platoon, could only listen, never reply. A German tanker later recalled, "When our commander was hit, we became deaf and blind. We fought alone." That difference, connection versus isolation, wasn't just tactical. It was psychological. American crews, constantly talking, developed trust and confidence. German crews, locked in silence, felt alone in the chaos. One sergeant from the 2nd Armored Division remembered, "We didn't just hear voices on the radio. We heard life. You knew someone had your back, even if you couldn't see them." The true test came in Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. When American tanks rolled ashore at Safi and Fadala in November 1942, their FM radios went live under fire for the first time. The results were stunning. In the confusion of landing, some Sherman crews lost sight of their units, yet they stayed coordinated through radio contact. Artillery support was called in minutes, not hours. Units could shift and adapt faster than any German counterpart. Reports from captured German intelligence units described American communication as flawless. Without interruption, they couldn't believe it. How could raw American crews with tanks inferior in armor and guns fight with such uncanny coordination? The answer lay not in the steel of the Sherman, but in the air around it, in invisible waves, linking every crew into one mind. As one German officer grimly noted in his after-action report, "They fight like a swarm, always in motion, always knowing." The Americans had unlocked something the Germans could neither see nor jam: the power of connection. But even this advantage had limits. When tanks advanced inland, a new problem appeared, one that could turn their strength into vulnerability. The radios worked perfectly between tanks, but not between tanks and infantry. And that gap would cost lives in the hedgerows of France. 3. The communication gap that almost broke the advantage. By the summer of 1944, the tide of war had turned. From the sands of North Africa to the mountains of Italy, American tank units had proven something extraordinary. They could think and move as one. But as they rolled through the French countryside after D-Day, the U.S. Army faced a deadly new challenge, one that no engineer had foreseen. The enemy was no longer miscommunication within the tank corps. It was miscommunication between the tanks and the men who fought beside them. June 6, 1944, as the first Sherman tanks rumbled off the landing craft onto Omaha Beach, their SCR-508 radios crackled with perfect clarity. Naval gunfire support, tank commanders, artillery observers all connected. But when the tanks reached the hedgerows of Normandy, that invisible web began to unravel. American infantry advanced through the bocage, thick, ancient hedges that turned every field into a fortress. The tanks needed infantry to spot hidden Panzerfaust teams. The infantry needed the tanks' guns to clear enemy strongpoints. Yet when soldiers shouted for help, tank crews couldn't hear them. The radios that had united the armored corps now cut them off from everyone else. The problem was technical, but fatal. The SCR-508 tank radios operated between 20, 0 and 27, Mertz, while the infantry's SCR-300 walkie-talkies ran on 40, 0 to 48, Mertz. They couldn't talk to each other. Infantrymen pounded on tank hulls, waving frantically. Tank commanders popped their hatches into gunfire, trying to listen. Misunderstandings turned to tragedy. Veteran accounts describe desperate moments when American infantry tried to warn tankers about German ambushes just meters away, but the words never got through. A young private from the 30th Infantry Division later wrote, "We could see the German rocket men crawling up, but the tanks kept moving forward. We screamed until our throats bled. Then the rockets hit." It was a cruel irony. The most connected army in the world had created a wall of silence between its own branches. The solution came not from high command, but from the field itself. In late June 1944, a tank mechanic named Corporal James R. McLeod of the 2nd Armored Division made a discovery that would save countless lives. Frustrated by the communication gap, he took a field telephone, the EE-8, and wired it directly to the tank's intercom system. He mounted it on the back of the tank in a waterproof ammunition box. Now, infantrymen could simply run up, pick up the phone, and talk directly to the tank crew inside. The idea spread overnight. Within weeks, Army engineers had standardized McLeod's invention. By Operation Cobra in late July, nearly every Sherman tank carried an infantry phone welded to its rear armor, a simple wire that changed the way armies fought forever. A sergeant from the 4th Armored Division described it as the moment we became one army again. Under the blistering summer sun, the U.S.'s 2nd Armored Division, hell on wheels, prepared to break out from the Normandy hedgerows. Inside the Shermans, radio chatter filled the air. Red 1 to Red 2, shift right flank. Copy that. We have infantry contact. Requesting fire on grid 47. Now, Infantry could pick up the rear phone and relay enemy positions instantly. Tankers responded within seconds. The Germans, trapped by rigid command channels, couldn't believe what they were facing. Captured after the battle, an officer of the Panzer Lehr Division said, "We fought against ghosts. They were everywhere at once, as if their tanks and soldiers shared one mind." That shared mind wasn't just a metaphor. It was a new kind of warfare. Every Sherman was part of a living network. Tankers talking to infantry, infantry to artillery, artillery to command, all in real time. When one tank spotted an ambush, every nearby unit knew within seconds. Artillery support arrived in 3 to 5 minutes, compared to the Germans' 20 to 30. What had begun as a technical advantage had evolved into a doctrine network-centric warfare. Decades before the term existed, during Operation Cobra, U.S. armor advanced nearly 60 miles in just 5 days, a pace the Wehrmacht couldn't match. Not because of firepower, but because of communication. For the men inside those tanks, the radio wasn't just equipment. It was lifeline and comfort. They could hear other voices, other human beings, even in the loneliest moments of war. A gunner from the 3rd Armored Division recalled, "When you heard another crewman's voice over the static, you didn't feel trapped anymore. You felt part of something bigger, a team that could think and fight together." German crews never had that comfort. When their command tanks were destroyed, their platoons were silenced. Alone in the noise of battle, many fought and died without ever hearing another human voice. In the end, it wasn't just steel or skill that separated the two sides. It was the simple human power of hearing each other's voices. But while the Americans refined their invisible web of coordination, the Germans were facing a crisis they couldn't fix, one that would define the rest of the war. Their tanks were strong, their guns were deadly, but without connection, their army was going blind. The silence of the Panzers. By late 1944, Germany's once invincible armored divisions were shadows of their former selves. The panzer brigades that had stormed across Europe in 1939 were now bleeding out, not just from Allied firepower, but from something far more insidious: silence. In every shattered town and smoking field, German tank crews faced a truth they could no longer deny. Their tanks were stronger, their guns deadlier. But in the modern battlefield, power meant nothing if you couldn't speak. In contrast, the Americans had turned communication into an art form. Each Sherman wasn't just a tank. It was a talking weapon, linked by radio to every other tank, artillery piece, and aircraft within range. When the 4th Armored Division clashed with the elite Panzer brigades near Aracourt in September 1944, the difference was decisive. On paper, the Germans held every advantage. Their Panthers could destroy Shermans from over a mile away. But the battle wasn't fought on paper. As the fog lifted over the Lorraine plain, the Americans moved like water. Tank commanders relayed enemy positions instantly. Artillery was called in through the same radio net. Tank destroyers were redirected mid-fight. Within hours, German formations began to collapse in confusion. Their command tanks, the only ones capable of transmitting, were picked off by American fire. Once they burned, the entire unit fell silent. A German after-action report captured the despair. "When our command vehicle was hit, our platoon ceased to exist as a coordinated force." By the time the smoke cleared, the U.S. 4th Armored had destroyed 281 German armored vehicles while losing only 41 Shermans, a staggering 7-to-1 ratio. American commanders understood that victory wasn't just about steel and ammunition. It was about tempo. The faster you could communicate, the faster you could act. This doctrine reached its zenith in March 1945, when the 9th Armored Division discovered the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, still standing over the Rhine. Within minutes, radio calls rippled through the airwaves. From the first tank across the river to headquarters miles away, every commander knew the gateway into Germany was open. Within an hour, entire divisions were moving to exploit the opportunity. The Germans, relying on telephone lines that Allied bombers had shredded days earlier, could do nothing. Their messages never got through. Field Marshal Walter Model's last transmission before total radio failure was chillingly brief. No contact with adjacent units. No contact with higher command. Fighting continues. but coordination impossible. In those words, the fate of the Wehrmacht was sealed. As the Allied tanks fanned out across Germany, American communication networks grew denser. Forward air controllers, equipped with modified SCR-508 sets, guided P-47 Thunderbolts onto targets just minutes after tankers radioed sightings. Artillery observers riding in half-tracks could adjust barrages in real time. German forces scattered, deaf, and blind could only react. Each counterattack arrived piecemeal, doomed by the same flaw that had haunted them since North Africa. Isolation? For American crews, the radio wasn't just a tool, it was protection. In countless diaries and letters, tankers described the relief of hearing a familiar voice through the static proof they weren't alone in that roaring world of smoke and fear. A loader from the 5th Armored wrote home, "You don't think about courage when you hear the others talking. You just keep moving. You know they'll be there when you call." That constant link, invisible yet unbreakable, forged a bond stronger than any armor plate. For the Germans, silence was death. When a tank's radio failed, the crew felt it instantly, a suffocating isolation in the middle of battle. One surviving Panzer commander later confessed, "You can endure anything in war except not knowing." By April 1945, the pattern was complete. The Ruhr pocket fell in a matter of days. More than 325,000 German troops surrendered, many without ever receiving a single coordinated order. Inside the encirclement, chaos reigned. Units couldn't find each other. Messages never arrived. To American observers, it was as if the entire German army had gone mute. The war had begun with the image of roaring panzers sweeping across Europe. It ended with the sound of silence broken only by the calm. Steady voices of Sherman crews moving in perfect coordination. The irony was inescapable. Germany had invented modern armored warfare. General Heinz Guderian's 1935 book Achtung Panzer had declared, "The tank's power lies in the wireless." And yet, 8 years later, his own army had lost, not because they forgot that lesson, but because America had perfected it. The United States didn't just build tanks. They built a network, a living, breathing organism made of men, machines, and the radio waves that bound them. It was the first true digital battlefield, long before anyone used that word, and it changed warfare forever. 5. The Invisible Revolution. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the world counted victory in numbers: tanks built, cities destroyed, miles conquered. But buried beneath the statistics was a quieter revolution, one that few soldiers or generals fully understood at the time. It wasn't the number of tanks that won the war. It was the connection between them. At the heart of that revolution was a 181-pound box of wires and vacuum tubes, the SCR-508. To the untrained eye, it was nothing remarkable, just another piece of equipment bolted inside a Sherman. But in reality, it was the nervous system of the U.S. Army. Each radio contained 2 receivers and 1 transmitter, capable of linking 10 preset channels across entire divisions. Tank commanders could monitor multiple frequencies at once: platoon nets, company command, and artillery coordination. German crews, in comparison, were trapped inside a one-way system. Most of their tanks carried only receivers. When the leader went silent, so did the unit. An American officer later wrote in his after-action report, "When you knocked out their lead tank, the others froze. When you knocked out ours, another took command within seconds." That was the essence of the Allied advantage: resilience through communication. The U.S. Army Signal Corps understood this long before the generals did. Their 1943 doctrine stated, "A command is only as strong as its lines of communication." Every new Sherman leaving Detroit's factories came with a radio already installed and tested. By 1944, 100% of American tanks were equipped with transceivers capable of transmitting and receiving. Germany, in contrast, produced barely 6,000 few G5 transceivers during the same period, enough to fully equip only 1 in 5 of its medium or heavy tanks. The most astonishing part was how fast the United States made it happen. Before the war, Motorola was a small car radio manufacturer. By 1945, Its Chicago plant was producing tens of thousands of precision radios every year, each one a marvel of miniaturized engineering. Engineers designed specialized shock mounts to protect tubes from recoil, and power converters that filtered out engine noise. Women in assembly lines, nicknamed the Voices of Victory, soldered the circuitry by hand, often under magnifying lenses. Every SCR-508 that rolled off the line was tested in a simulated tank hull to ensure clarity even during simulated explosions. The attention to detail bordered on obsession, but it paid off. A post-war report from the U.S. Army Technical Intelligence Service concluded bluntly, German communications were 5 years behind U.S. standards in both design and application. The effect on soldiers was psychological as much as tactical. For American tankers, the constant radio chatter created a sense of belonging, a reminder that they weren't alone. They developed their own radio slang, their own cadence of clipped, confident phrases. Red 2, we see them. Copy. Red 3, hold fire until my mark. Those words carried more than orders. They carried trust. For German crews, silence was isolation. In Otto Carius's memoir, Tigers in the Mud, he described the frustration of trying to lead in radio darkness. Without communication, a tank is no more than a coffin that moves. Carius was right. In the age of the network, isolation was death. By 1945, this principle had transformed the entire Allied command structure. The combat command concept, flexible, temporary task forces assembled from mixed units, was possible only because of universal radio compatibility. Where the Wehrmacht clung to rigid hierarchies, the Americans embraced fluidity. Tank platoons, artillery, engineers, and reconnaissance units could be reshuffled daily without losing coordination. This adaptability turned battles like Aricourt, the Ardennes, and the Rhine crossing into exercises in dynamic warfare where information, not armor, dictated success. German commanders couldn't comprehend it. Their reports spoke of chaos that appears coordinated, enemy units changing direction without orders, and radio silence masking precise action. They were witnessing the birth of network warfare decades before anyone called it that. When the guns stopped, historians debated which tank was the best of the war, the Tiger, the Panther, or the Sherman, but the answer, in truth, wasn't in the armor or the gun. It was in the signal. The SCR-508 turned every Sherman into a node of a single, thinking organism. It gave American tank crews something the Germans never had, a voice that could reach beyond the noise of battle. That voice won the war, and yet, the lessons of those invisible waves didn't end in 1945. Half a century later, during the Gulf War of 1991, coalition forces equipped with superior communications annihilated Iraqi armored units armed with Soviet-built tanks. Those Soviet designs, though powerful, suffered from the same flaw that doomed the Panzers' poor coordination. Once again, the connected defeated the isolated. The same story repeated in 2003, when American forces swept into Baghdad, using digital battlefield networks, direct descendants of the SCR-508. In the end, the humble Sherman mocked for its thin armor, and small gun proved that wars are not only won by the strongest tank, but by the best connected army. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel reportedly summed it up best at Germany's surrender. We knew how to build better tanks, but you knew how to make them work together. That line, whether apocryphal or not, captured the truth. The Sherman didn't win because it was invincible. It won because it spoke, and through its radio waves, an entire army learned to think as one. The war for the electromagnetic spectrum had begun, and it never ended. From the desert of Tunisia to the digital battlefields of today, one lesson remains. Connection equals survival. Isolation equals defeat. If you love uncovering history's hidden revolutions, the unseen battles that changed everything, subscribe to War Chronicles, where the past still speaks.